Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Institute for Australian and Chinese Arts and Culture at Western Sydney University. I'm Professor Jing Han, the director of the Institute. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that our institute is on Parramatta South Campus, which is on the country of the Darug people of the Darug Nation, and acknowledge their ancestors who have been the traditional owners of the country for thousands of years. We also want to pay our respect to the First Nations elders of the countries we are sitting on today, past, present, and emerging. Welcome to My China Story Conversation Series. As you know, due to the change of circumstances, which has become part of our lives for the last couple of years, we have moved this session to online. While it is a shame that we won't have a face-to-face conversation with Richard, and I, for one, have been looking forward to it since we had to postpone it in the first instance after the outbreak of the COVID in 2020. But we are also very pleased, as many of you are, that many more people from all over Sydney, from interstate and internationally, now can attend this not to be missed session. We have to postpone the Chinese Music Appreciation number 3 featuring Yang Qing to the next session. That means we can have a few more questions from the audience after my conversation with Richard following Richard's presentation. The aim of my China Story Conversation series is to bring a deeper and a wider understanding of the multifaceted and humanized China through sharing lived experiences and the knowledge of China by public figures of Australians from a range of professions. For this third episode, we are thrilled to have one of the foremost experts on China and East Asia, award-winning journalist and best-selling author, Richard McGregor. And it is our great honor and privilege to have Professor Jocelyn Chey to open this session. Professor Chey is the founding director of this institute, an adjunct professor at UTS and a visiting professor at the University of Sydney. Her career with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade spanned 30 years from the 1970s to 1990s, and she held many distinguished diplomatic appointments, including being the first cultural counselor and then senior trade commissioner in the Australian Embassy in Beijing, and a consul general for Australia in Hong Kong. Professor Chey was the key administrative officer in the Australian China Council at the time it was established in 1979. She also worked as the director of the China branch of the International Wool Secretariat. She was awarded the Medal of Australia AM in 2009 and is a fellow of the Australian Institute for International Affairs. Please welcome Professor Jocelyn Chey AM to give the opening remarks.
Thank you, Professor Han. And it's a delight to be here this afternoon, even if only virtually. In December this year, it will be exactly half a century since the establishment of diplomatic relations between Australia and China. Close on the heels of the original agreement in 1972, there was another agreement for the mutual exchange of journalists. Anne-Marie Brady, in her book about that period, of the formative period of Chinese foreign policy, which is called Making the Foreign Serve China, gives some details. And she quotes Premier Zhou Enlai's statement of 5 principles that should govern exchanges with foreign journalists. So I would like to start by referring to Premier Zhou Enlai's 5 principles. They were: first, do not reject those who come, but be discriminating in how you treat them. Second, be prudent, but not overcautious. Maintain secrecy, but do not be mysterious. Take the initiative, but do not act rashly. 3. Reply to reporters' questions. Do not overuse no comment. 4th, as for provocations, rebut them in a principled manner, but don't get aggressive. And lastly, hospitality towards foreign reporters should include questions and answers. It should lead us to a greater awareness of the situation, and we should selectively and deliberately make friends. Well, December 72, when we established diplomatic relations, was not actually the first time that Australian journalists stepped across the border into what was then called Red China. The previous year, there were 7 pioneers who accompanied Gough Whitlam when he was leader of the opposition on his first visit to China. And that included some famous names in modern Chinese journalism. Philip Koch, Alan Barnes, Laurie Oakes. The 7 of them were all present at the critical meeting on the 5th of July with Zhou Enlai in the Great Hall of the People in Beijing. And I think that was possibly the one and only time that journalists were welcome observers at such a high-level meeting between Australia and China. It was soon after Gough's election that I left Sydney for Canberra to go and work in the Department of, it was then a separate department, Overseas Trade, to help develop their China trade policy. And I was in Canberra when the advance party of diplomats arrived from China in early 1973, ready to set up their embassy. I quickly got to know these first Chinese visitors, and I learned that the party included 2 journalists who were, for all intents and purposes, part of the embassy. One of them in particular became quite a good friend, Ye Jin, who worked for the Xinhua news agency. And I kept in touch with Ye after he returned to Beijing. So I know that he continued to take a keen interest in Australian affairs. And he published what is possibly the first book published in China after 1949 about Australia. It has a very simple name, Audalia, Australia, published by Xinhua in 1976. Reciprocal accreditation for Australian journalists in China was soon provided. The ABC and the Sydney Morning Herald both availed themselves of the opportunity to open offices in Beijing. And a recently published book, which I recommend to you, The Beijing Bureau, brings together some fascinating stories of those people, the first, the icebreakers, and those who followed, including our guest speaker this afternoon, Richard McGregor. So I myself went to Beijing in March 1975 to work in the embassy. And I was met at the airport on arrival by a colleague from the embassy, Jeff Marginson, and by the first Herald correspondent, Margaret Jones. Margaret's presence at the airport made a deep impression on me. I hadn't realized before how closely everyone in the embassy was going to work with the 2 press representatives. And Margaret made a deep impression on the 2 children that I took with me, because on the spot, she invited them to come to her apartment at the weekend and promised to bake a cake for them. It's a seemingly insignificant detail, but it actually tells you quite a lot about what a small community it was in Beijing in those days, and how important the professional and personal relationships were between diplomats and journalists. Perhaps we've lost something in recent years. The Australian diaspora in China grew a lot later on. And when the community is larger, and when communication between overseas posts and the home country is easier with technologies like first fax and phone and internet, it makes it much easier for people to keep in touch with family and with colleagues at home, and you're less dependent on the connections that you have in the local community. Before I move on, I'd like to just to acknowledge the work that Margaret Jones did in China. It's unfortunate there's no contribution from her in the Beijing Bureau because she passed away in 2006. But we should remember her pioneering work in China and her work for women journalists in the profession. Like Ye Jin, who continued to take an interest in Australia after he returned home, Margaret also closely followed events in China after she came back to Sydney in 1975, including the death of Mao, 1976, and the arrest of the Gang of Four. Some of her reflections on China and its politics can be found in her novel, The Confucius Enigma, published in Sydney in 1979. The plot of this novel centers on the reported death of Lin Biao and political attacks on Lin and Confucius that prompt an Australian journalist, Alan Brock is called in the novel, to investigate. And with his assistant, the two of them believe that Lin may still be alive, and then they get drawn into a vicious domestic power struggle. It's quite heady stuff. Richard, of course, is one of Margaret's notable successors, having been in China and Japan, corresponding for the Australian and bureau chief for the Financial Times in Beijing and Shanghai between 2000 and 2009. He is now a senior fellow at the Lowy Institute, and he spent time with the Wilson Center in Washington and the Sigur Center at George Washington University. He's perhaps best known for his 2011 book, The Party, The Secret World of China's Communist Rulers, which won the Asia Society Award that year for the best book on Asia. It's a book that opened the eyes of many Western observers. Many of them had previously assumed that the government of the People's Republic of China functioned like a Western government, and the Communist Party of China functioned like a Western political party. That is, they believed, and some of them still believe, that all political parties, whether in Australia or China, just spring into action in the lead up to elections, and that after the elections, it's not the party, but the government, or the ministers that run the show, but the departmental officers in a fairly pragmatic fashion, as you might perhaps gather if you, like me, have enjoyed the BBC classic show, Yes, Minister. Do you remember Yes, Minister? It's interesting that it was almost as popular in China as it was in Australia. I just digress for a minute because in preparing to speak this, I looked up one of the episodes where the public servant Bernard says, "It's our job to carry out government policies, so shouldn't we believe in them?" And Sir Humphrey says, "What an extraordinary idea! I've served 11 governments in the past 30 years. If I'd believed in all their policies, I would have been a stark, raving schizophrenic. Well, I can assure you that's not how the Chinese public service operates. Above all, it conforms with national policies through the all-pervasive structure of party cells and representatives. What Richard explained to the world was that for every government, business, or academic body in China, there was a shadow party equivalent, and those party offices maintain their advisory and policy making roles continuously. I hope that I haven't reduced your book to triviality, Richard. Well, much has been written about diplomats and journalists and the relationship in China and elsewhere in the world. You might be forgiven for thinking that diplomats live in a world of secrecy, intrigue, and spying, and that they dread openness and inquiries that are in the public interest, particularly perhaps in these post-WikiLeaks days. So you would assume that diplomats zealously maintain their distance from press representatives, but of course that is in fact far from the truth. In all countries, there are complex networks between embassies and press bureaus, professional and friendly. Both sides have a lot to gain from good working relationships. One of the tragic consequences of COVID and of the deterioration of relations between China and Australia has been the closure of representative offices in Beijing and Shanghai. Journalists who should be reporting in the field on China have been the victims of badly handled diplomatic relations and have lost their valuable relationships with embassies and consulates. Let's hope that our China press offices can reopen soon, and that journalists will then be able better to contribute to understanding of developments in China. And finally, let us also hope that Australian journalist Cheng Lei is released from detention and reunited with her family as soon as possible. Without more ado, I'd like now to hand over to Professor Han and to Richard. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn, for this great and very informative speech. And as you can tell, Jocelyn has many interesting stories about China herself. And we will have an opportunity to hear Jocelyn's My China story in this series. So with the Jocelyn's introduction of Richard, let's now welcome Richard to give his presentation.
Thank you, Jing. Thank you, Jocelyn. Jocelyn, you probably don't remember, I think I even hounded you once, questions about the former and late Prime Minister Bob Hawke. I think that conversation was only a little bit open, not entirely open, but I won't disclose it entirely here. But look, thanks for everybody for sticking through this COVID. I had been running my own sort of personal Chinese-style COVID zero policy in the house, and we haven't had a COVID case at all. But both children now, I've discovered, like Xi Jinping, it's very hard to control. But I've got a couple of cases in the house, not me yet. So it made this event go online. And so Jing, been very nicely asking me to speak here today, is going to force me to do something that I never do, and that is, or rarely do, even at home, and that is talk about myself, and particularly my relationship with China. And I'm going to sort of gradually get to the topic about China, because I think, you know, the way one views China, you can sort of flesh that out, if you like, by talking a little bit about your own background. I mean, I come from Sydney. I come from a very large Catholic family. I think my grandmother had 6 children, and 5 of her children had 8 children. The other one was a priest. And we've got a couple of cousins who are still nuns, which is are rare these days. I grew up on the North Shore, which, you know, speaking to the University of Western Sydney audience, must absolutely create great palpitations. But I think in many respects, I've been sort of trying to escape the North Shore my entire life, because it was always sort of too quiet and too sort of settled and comfortable for me. But to give my parents credit, they were very outward looking. My mother was a Christian volunteer in Germany after the war, and she spoke German, Italian, and French. I think she was one of those people, very common those days in Australia, who thought Australia was a very boring country and that foreign countries were much more exciting and interesting. That rubbed off on her children a little. And my father was a barrister, but he'd been in the war in Burma, now Myanmar, but he'd also been a prosecutor and a defense counsel for Japanese war criminals in Hong Kong after the war. So these, we always in the family had a very outward looking view of the world, and that was the sort of house we grew up in. And so I think there's a number of things from me from a young age. I think I always wanted to be a journalist. I was always obsessed with the news. I always wanted to go to Asia, not necessarily China then. I can distinctly remember the very first time I got off a plane at Changi Airport in Singapore, and those days there were no air bridges, and it was that you were hit by that smell of a diesel fuel, intense humidity, the noise of the jet engines, and that was really exhilarating actually, and I think it sort of helped set me off on the path overseas. Now, most Australians went to London and New York. That seemed to be very dull and predictable and, too easy, I think. I started to focus on China, I guess, when I was about 20 in the early 80s. I was working at the Sydney Morning Herald in Canberra. I remembered the Whitlam breakthrough in the 1971-72, but at the Hawke government's engagement with China at that time was also really exciting. I had a friend, Robert Thompson, who was posted to China in the 1980s. By the way, he's the global head of News Limited these days, the Murdoch newspaper empire, and has strong connections to China because he married a Chinese woman. He also, by the way, in those days, the Australian journalists, correspondents for the Fairfax papers, the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age, were also the correspondents for the Financial Times. So many Australian journalists posted from Australia actually were automatically sort of turned into global figures. But in 1987, I remember I had a 2-week trip to Beijing, Shanghai, Guilin, and Guangdong, and Hong Kong. And I think that's what sold me. And I decided I would come back. It didn't take much for me to realize that this was really the most interesting place in the world. And I think more to the point, a much more meaningful place to work. Now, I don't want to make that sound, like a sort of eat your broccoli, but it was also more important for, as an Australian, I think, we were engaged there in a way that was much more meaningful than in other countries. And I think groping towards an understanding of China is a much bigger thrill than sort of, finding out about something in the US and the UK. It's much fresher, it's much more of an achievement and much more of a challenge. Still, it took me a few more years to get to China full time. I had applied for a few jobs in China, but not gotten them. And so I basically just in 88, 89, packed my bags. I was working at the ABC in Melbourne and I moved to Taiwan, first for a month's holidays. And then a year later, I came back and moved there permanently to study. To summarize my career from that point, I basically, instead of getting a job in China, I got a job in Japan for 5 years for the ABC and the Australian. My pages of my speech here are all mixed up. That's terrible. Anyway, I worked for the Australian in Japan. I stayed there for 5 years in Tokyo. I moved to Hong Kong during the handover from 95 to 97 while traveling up and down to China that time, and I established an office for the Australian. After 8 years overseas, I moved back to Canberra for 2 years to be political correspondent for the paper. I always associate my downtimes in China with being in Changsha, which, though I love Hunan food, always seemed to be sort of grey and unwelcoming and wet. And that's when I decided to get out. But in 2000, I was offered a job with the Financial Times in Shanghai. Then I came back, and that stint lasted for a decade. So in short, from 89, I went to Melbourne, to Taiwan, to Hong Kong, to Beijing, to Canberra, to Shanghai, to Beijing. After that, to London and Washington. And I think you learn a good lesson in that respect about being a journalist. If you want to build your career, you just have to want to keep moving. It will be willing to keep moving and to do so quickly. Now, Jing is going to ask me some questions, but I want to talk first about why I enjoyed China, my approach to the job, and why I think I was very lucky to be in Taiwan and Japan before landing in China itself. I also want to say why I think growing up in Sydney helped me a lot, actually, which might sound a little bit odd. You know, Taiwan, when I went there in 88, 89, was really just becoming a democracy, a really exciting time. Political prisoners were being let out of jail. Li Denghui, for example, became president. And, you know, this is one of the fascinating things about Taiwan, and I think it's embodied in many ways in President Li. You know, he grew up in Japanese colonialism. He only went to China once in his entire life, and that was on a Japanese troop ship in the war to Qingdao. He spoke much better Japanese than he did Chinese. And he never felt Chinese, in fact. And it was a good example for me to understand how distinctive Taiwan was in that respect. I also think it helps understand Taiwan because Taiwan is very difficult to read if you're there. People from the outside in Australia and the like think everything in Taiwan is about cross-straits relations. In fact, a lot of it is very domestic politics, and cross-straits relations gets mixed up in that. So Taiwan, for me, was a really good way to understand not just how separate Taiwan, but its relationship with China and the really deep complexities of that. And Deng Xiaoping once said, you know, he said we should unify with Taiwan quickly while the old guys are all still alive, because we understand about one China. We all believe in it. But if we leave it too long, it's not going to be easy. And he was exactly right. Secondly, Japan. Now, why is Japan valuable? I think one of the really valuable things about Japan is that, you know, Japan has, like China, it has a free press. It's not the same, but it has a very opaque political system and bureaucracy and the way they're intertwined. And it's, you know, so you have to really work hard to understand what's going on there. It's also very important because the Japanese have this habit of mixing up politics and culture. It's like politics in the guise of culture. Let me give you an example about that. And, you know, there was a long time of foreigners trying to sell rice to the Japanese, and the Japanese bureaucrats would say, that doesn't fit with Japanese culture. Japanese only like Japanese rice. Whereas, in fact, the truth was Japan had this very powerful agricultural lobby, and they were the ones making up these cultural excuses. And so I think it's a lesson for me in politics, in an opaque sort of political system, just to look for where the power lies and be careful about cultural arguments. And that also is something I've really thought about in China as well, where many Chinese officials will tell you that harmony is a natural sort of Chinese value and trait and the like. And Chinese naturally don't like democracy. It's not part of their culture. But I think you first have to look to political arrangements. And that's what Japan taught me, and it was a valuable lesson for China. Another thing that Japan was very valuable for, you know, in the 1990s when I was there, Japan was America's big rival. And America did not like it at all. And there was a quite hostile relationship between Japan and America. Some of it was very racially tinged, actually, in both ways, but obviously particularly from the American side about, the yellow people rising up and the like. And even though Japan and the US were military allies, it was a very, a superpower challenged will always push back. And of course, we see exactly the same phenomenon now between the US and China. There's many issues between those two countries, but if you want to think of it, it's about power as well. Superpowers don't just retire, and there was something I learned a lot from being in Japan as well. And finally, the thing that helped me write about Chinese politics and actually write about the Communist Party, and this is the weird thing that I'm going to say to you, but growing up in Sydney and being interested in politics, it's changed around in recent years, but Sydney and New South Wales used to be a Labor Party state. And of course, the Labor Party in New South Wales for many years, not anymore, used to have a fearsome political machine, which we used to just call Sussex Street. Was a legend, had its own sort of legend built around it. And if you cover a political machine, be it Tammany Hall, be it Sussex Street, or frankly, the Chinese Communist Party, they've got a lot of things in common. They're secretive, and they have a number of core functions. One is to hang on to power at any cost, and the other is to distribute patronage and jobs. And as Kevin Rudd once pointed out to me quite wryly, he said, yes, well, there's a reason why the head of the New South Wales Labor Party in Sussex Street is called the General Secretary. And I hadn't really thought of that before. Anyway, after my stint in China in the 90s, I returned in 2000. And I was very lucky to be coming back then. I think, as we all know, as you get older, luck is an underestimated part of life. And I was lucky for two reasons. Why is that? First of all, I was with the Financial Times, which was a paper with global reach, and so I got better access. It was also a global paper that was not American, so the Chinese were much more willing to deal with you because they didn't think you were part of an American plot. And also in around 2000, that's when China joined the World Trade Organization. And they were opening up to the world like never before. They were listing their banks and oil companies on foreign stock markets. So they had to talk to the press whether they liked it or not. I mean, I certainly believe they never liked it, but they had to open up because they had an investment class they had to appeal to. Now, we often look back at the time when China joined the WTO, and we all assumed that it was a guaranteed success. But of course, that's not the case, and it's not how it was seen at the time. There's a famous book called The Coming Collapse of China by Gordon Chang. And he was a lawyer when I was in Shanghai in 2000. And he was writing his book about the coming collapse of China. And I remember that very clearly. And his reason, his rationale for saying China would sort of wilt was that it would not, its companies couldn't withstand international competition. Now, Gordon actually was a nice guy. But he was completely wrong. And he's a few times was a little bit embarrassed about the title of his book, but he kind of says these days, well, it's coming sooner or later, let's move on sort of thing. But anyway, so the WTO, I almost felt like in Shanghai, there was, a new skyscraper on the corner every day. There was just so much happening. The country economically just took off. We had lots of access to senior officials. It was easier to report. It was easy to travel. I've got one photo, I don't know whether I sent it to Jing, of me, I think, in Wuxi or somewhere like that. And it's a photo of me with a number of officials outside their company. And it's got a massive placard and it says, "Welcome, Richard McGregor, visit our company." I do not think you would get that these days. Now, we got lots of visits from security officials for cups of tea. You know, the local staff were harassed, but it was far better atmosphere than it is now. And I'll give you a very good example of that, and then I'll shut up. I sort of finished up with the FT in 2008, and I decided I wanted to write a book about the Communist Party. But I really didn't tell anybody that, because, you know, you don't really want to tell the Chinese that. So I said to the Chinese Foreign Ministry, I said, look, I'd like my visa extended for a year. I'm going to write a book about how China works, which of course was completely accurate. They literally gave me an extension of a visa in 4 days. Which is like a land speed record for the foreign ministry dealing with journalists. And that was because it was at the time of the Olympics, and they were putting their best foot forward. I'm not going to say it's all been downhill for the press since then, but go back to Jocelyn's comments at the beginning, and the 5 rules or edicts or suggestions put out by Zhou Enlai. I think these days we'd be pretty happy to even get no comment, because that's the state we've fallen into. Anyway, I will leave it there, so I don't want to go over time, and I'm happy to, and Jing, over to you, I think.
Oh, thank you so much, Richard. I'm so pleased that we got you to talk about your story. You know, it's just so interesting and fascinating. And we do get to see, to understand a lot more about your views as well. You know, there is a Chinese saying, 文如其人, meaning one's writing is a reflection of one's character. And that's exactly how I felt about Richard after reading his books. Honestly, I can't recommend those 2 books highly enough. Richard has this very distinctive and intelligent storytelling style, which is highly engaging, but not through any sensationalization. Very insightful, but with in-depth knowledge. What he presents isn't just newsworthy information, which is these days quickly overtaken or outdated by, you know, incessant incoming stream of new information. Richard has an incredibly observant mind and a remarkable critical capability to go with it. And also, I have to say that his ability or super ability to gain access to hard to find information through knowing right people, trawling through documents, and through his analytical skills simply amazes me. We will touch on some of those qualities in my conversation with Richard. During our conversation, you can post your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and I will collect them at the end of the conversation for Richard to respond. So now, Richard, let's start our conversation. Here's my first question, which you touch on a bit, but I want you to elaborate a bit more. You started your journalistic career at Sydney University, writing for the students' newspaper and the Rolling Stone magazine, and you played in a rock band. You could have been a rock star instead of becoming the author of the party. You touch on the set in the 1970s when many young people really in Australia interested in pursuing their career in UK and Europe or United States. But you turned to Asia, and you even made an effort to study Chinese part-time at that time. So where did this fascination over Asia or China, Chinese language at least, come from?
I just want to say I can absolutely assure you I would never have been a rock star. It's not very good. But look, I just think it was, I don't know, it's hard to know where these things come from. China, I think, is, I mean, I think my parents, as I said, pushed us to look out into the world and take risks in that respect. So they were very encouraging. I think it's the thing about China. I just think it's, it's the whether you like it or not, however critical you are of the Communist Party, it is still the biggest thing happening, in the world for the past 50 years. And it's not just about, a rising superpower. It's the extraordinary sort of history that precedes that, going back to the mid-19th century, Western imperialism, the various wars, the Chinese Civil War, the Chinese Revolution, the dark days under Mao until the opening of the market. And so it's this sort of, I think it's the drama of that attracted me. And I guess also the secrecy makes it more challenging. There's a deal of intrigue in China to get your head around and try and assess the politics there accurately. I also found really exciting. So I guess it's the combination of those two things.
You mentioned in your presentation that you couldn't get to China in the first place as you originally planned. So you went to Taiwan first instead, and then you moved on to Japan. And then, having been in Taiwan and in Japan, paved your way and influenced your approach to China. So when you finally got to China, what was your first impression of China?
Yeah, so I lived actually in Hong Kong before I actually lived in China, and obviously very, very different, I think. I think there were some people who would argue that Taiwan and Hong Kong were or are much more traditionally Chinese than China itself was under communism. And so I guess the main thing that I guess I focused on is is noticeable is the sheer high tempo economic energy. You might remember that in the 1950s, when Japan was re-emerging, that some people called them economic animals, which is obviously disparaging. But these were societies with pent-up energy, pent-up demand, a real desire to make their lives better, to become richer, which of course is a utterly noble ambition. And I think you see that transferred into China, I think. And it's one reason why I think many people are surprised that the Communist Party probably has a lot of popular support. I'm very critical of the Communist Party, but if you look at any surveys, they probably have popular support. And it's very simple to understand that because people's lives have got better. So the thing that really I found most striking was just the economic energy in all of these places and the sort of palpable effort to get rich.
Yes, I could remember those days, yes. And you were there in Hong Kong and Beijing during the lead up to and when Hong Kong was returned to China. And there has been a lot talked about. I just want to ask you, in your coverage, looking back, which event or experience or interview left an unforgettable mark in your memory and why?
Yes, you mentioned this before, and I should have thought about that more deeply. People often ask me about where I liked living, and I frankly have found everywhere interesting for me. So, but I think you can't have been at the Hong Kong handover like I was and not have been struck by it. I could remember beforehand the Chinese negotiating to make sure that the British flag was down the flagpole at least 30 seconds before midnight, so the Chinese flag could be at the top of the flagpole by midnight. It couldn't be there 30 seconds after midnight. So I think the Hong Kong handover, which was, as most people remember, a really wet night, that was a really striking moment for me. I think interviewing people coming out of jail in Taiwan in 89, 90, that was a very striking moment for me. And I think and this will sound not very exciting, but working for a financial paper, the Financial Times, we interviewed a lot of, officials, financial officials and the like. And collectively, I think that was one of the most interesting things for me, because we actually got in to see officials. You get a sense of how they deal with outsiders, how they deal with their underlings, how they, I've always been impressed by how supple Chinese bureaucrats are in weaving. You have to be very sinuous in China, I think, if you're a bureaucrat or anything, but to sort of work your way through all the obstacles that are put in your path. And so if you want to ask me about a collective experience, because people don't get this anymore, because China thinks it doesn't need foreigners as much. We've, of course, got COVID as well, but they don't need us anymore. They certainly don't need foreign journalists, so they don't want to talk to us. They don't like us. But I got a sort of a massive collective experience of interviewing a lot of top-level Chinese officials. And that was almost every time we did that, I was very educational. It's also made me never to underestimate the Chinese bureaucracy or the party, if you like, because they have so many levers of power at their fingertips.
Yeah, there are a lot of skills there. So my next question, when I travel to new places and countries, I always believe that working out a local public transport system is a breakthrough, because that allows me most freedom and the most access. But the obviously initial task is always very challenging, because before you're able to see if there is any system at all, the whole thing appears like an impenetrable mess. However, if you persevere, you will eventually detect some clues and patterns, and suddenly come to realization that every country, place, and city has its own functioning transport system. So as you touched on, China's government structure and governance system with its many layers of intricacies and compounded by the opaque and secrecy nature. In Chinese and to Chinese, it is called confidential 保密. Those things are just too complex. What were your ways of working all that out? Did you have that epiphany moment when the last few jigsaw puzzles fell into places?
It's an interesting question. On public transport, of course, I missed most of the subway building, so I didn't get to see all of that. I forgot to mention one meeting that it was one of the best I had. I met with, as part of a delegation, we had a night out with Bo Xilai when he was mayor of Dalian. A genuinely charismatic character. That was one of the best things I did. If you want to ask me a moment of epiphany, and this will sound very, very, I don't know whether I can communicate this properly, but I was thinking about the Communist Party and the political system and how to write about it. I was visiting one day the head of a foreign oil company in China. It was always good to talk to foreign businessmen in China, because if they were switched on, they really knew a lot, because they had to deal with regulators directly. BP, the company, was in a joint venture with, I think, Sinopec at the time. And so I went to see this guy, and he just made this off-the-cuff remark. And he said, oh, the boys from the party were over here today with their clipboards. And what he was talking about, of course, was that the organization department, which was is the personnel department, had sent people to interview him to check up on the character of the leading official in Sinopec. And that was a sort of, it doesn't sound very exciting actually, but that was a real moment of epiphany for me about the sort of reach and approach of the party in the way their tentacles and their interests spread just in every little direction. So I think that was an interesting, sort of epiphany. And I also, I think, was once visiting a steel mill in Ma'anshan or somewhere like that. I think that's in Anhui province from memory, near the border of another province. And, dealing with local officials, you want to get out of Beijing, local officials can be franker. And we had one of those lunches where they insisted you drink Maotai. I don't get drunk quickly, but I sort of get bad hangovers. And it was one of those things where you kind of wake up the next morning on the plane out of the town, and suddenly the lunch all sort of comes back to you. And we had one of the officials that day we're having lunch with, I remember, I think he had 3 lunches that day. Officials do this in China. They go from lunch to lunch to lunch. They do half an hour each one. And that was a sort of a telling moment for me, understanding the stressful and difficult life of an official in China, where you have to have this great art of human communication, empathy, and an athlete's stamina to go around and cultivate all the constituencies at that in day-to-day sort of thing, as well as drinking Maotai with the likes of me. Now, they kind of sound like trivial examples, but they're the ones that come to mind when you ask me. I'll no doubt remember better ones later.
Great examples. And as I said, you are very super observant, and so true. It is 3 lunches or 3 dinners or 5 dinners. That was very draining.
I only had 1 lunch.
You had 1. But, working through the system, the government system, where did you start? From the top or from the bottom?
Well, I started anywhere, mainly from the bottom. Now, when I was writing the book on the party, as I said, I said, and I wasn't lying, I just was, in the old phrase, economical with the truth. I was writing a book about how China was governed. So I would just, I took 6 months to research the book, 6 months to write it. And so I really just, I think in China, reporting on China is a bit like politics, is a bit like ancient history. You are trying to put an ancient Greek urn back together. And so you walk around, you get a little piece here, you get a little piece there, and gradually you can start to see the shape of things. Another friend of mine said it was like knitting a sweater. You just have to get a little bit of wool here and there, and gradually you can make something whole. So I just went around and saw as many people as I could. And I would just talk around the subject and about how things were run and what was the role of the government. And if they were comfortable in talking about the party, I would talk to them about the party. But I was kind of careful, because you don't want to put people in a position which makes them uncomfortable and also makes them think they have to report you if you're asking too sensitive questions. I didn't have anything to ask about national security, but I was just asking about structures of the party and the like. And one of the things that I did get for the book, which hadn't been published before, which is on the covers of one of the books you show, and that was about the red phone, and about how in those days, it might have changed with the digital world, all top leaders, like in the Soviet Union, had a red phone on their desk. And if somebody wanted to, contact somebody else within the system or something like that, they would use this secure internal phone line. And somebody just mentioned it to me one day from Min Metals company, who I was talking to. It's all the people in the state companies all had a really good idea of how the system worked because they were part of it. And then so when I would go to other meetings, at the end of the meeting, I might casually ask about the red phone, and lots of people talked about it. So I think I had a very softly approach, because I thought that was the best way to gather information, those bits of wool to make the whole sweater.
Well, I thoroughly enjoyed reading you the bestseller, The Party. It's really very, very interesting, enlightening, and incredibly insightful. And through this book, I've learned, being a Chinese, growing up in China, I've learned a lot of things that I didn't know or didn't see before. And the red phone is a red telephone is one of the examples. I'll get to that, and I want you to elaborate a bit more, because that reminds me of my own experience as a child growing up in China. In the early 70s, when dial-up telephones like this red phone, not red in those days for us, were rolled out to provincial middle-ranking officials. So one day, a group of people came to my home and installed a telephone. The novelty quickly wore off because the telephone basically was useless. It could only be used for my father to receive or make calls when some emergencies like a fire breakout occurred. So it was like a 000 phone, really. And sometime later, the same group of people came to our home to dismantle the phone and took it away. I was actually quite happy for them to do that, but I couldn't understand why my mother got so upset and had an argument with them. Later, the phone reappeared and disappeared again. So my young mind figured out that the phone was an indicator if my father was in trouble or out of trouble, or in or out. So can you tell us a bit more about how this red telephone works?
Well, that's a very interesting story of yours. It's a signal of both status or whether you're up or down. And certainly the red phone is a symbol of status. In other words, you only get it if you're at a certain level. And it's what the Chinese, the Russians used to call the nomenclatura, the list of names. In other words, you know, the party has about 97 million members these days, the Communist Party. But if you look at the central officials who are important and who are covered by the organization department, in other words, not the central committee, that's about 370 members, but all the officials who are at a certain level who have to be checked for loyalty, corruption, their families, the nomenclatura, the inner circle, there's only about, I think, it's hard to measure them, about 3,400 of those people in China. And that's who gets the red phone, because it's a symbol that you've joined the elite. Now, in some ways, that's a great thing, but it's like your father. Sometimes it's a dangerous thing, because you might get a call on your red phone from somebody very senior asking you to do something you don't want to do, asking you for a favor or something like that. And so people I spoke to said some of them were sort of excited to have the red phone, and others used to tremble when it rang. And, they might have been happy to retire and lose their red phone. So I think that's, it's a sort of symbol that you've made it. And like in most political systems, the higher you go, the more dangerous it gets.
Mm-hmm. I enjoy it because you unravel all these details more like a knowledge rather than, sensationalize them. So it's quite interesting. So obviously you got to know and had access to many well-informed people and people who were willing to talk to you as a foreign journalist. Chinese people, I'm making an overgeneralization here, are usually cautious when talking to foreign media. Not always because of the fear of the Chinese government, but they fear or feel that a foreign journalist often have ulterior motive. And also they are often being misunderstood by foreign journalists. So obviously having the trust, as you mentioned, a softer approach to get the trust is critical. How did you, there are a wide range of people that you access. How did you win their trust? And most importantly, how did you manage that trust?
Yes, well, it's a good question. I don't want to overstate my access. I'll tell you a story. After the party came out, China is a very thorough system. And a former British ambassador told me this. He told me that he'd been told that they did an internal report on the book. And they said the conclusion was that it was journalistic, superficial, contained errors. And I'm thinking, okay, so far so good. That could be a lot worse than that. They said, most importantly, it did not disclose top-level decision-making procedures. In other words, I didn't crack the secrets of the Politburo. So I made a very conscious effort in that book not to pretend that I knew what was really happening at the top. Because as you know, there's lots of people who do pretend they know, and I'm always suspicious about that. But that was also the time before China cracked down on Hong Kong, where if you went to the airport in Hong Kong, you would have all these lurid books, sensational books about what was going on, what Xi Jinping was thinking when he was shaving that morning, who was the top leaders' mistresses. They're all on sale there at Hong Kong airport, not anymore. And I didn't want to do a sort of English language version of that where I was sort of retailing rumors. So what I focused on was really party structure. And once you can do the party structure, you can fill in lots of little gaps with things that are public, with past interviews you've done, and the like, physical descriptions. And secondly, going, as I said, to the provinces, because the provincial people were much more open. Maybe they were a little bit more naive in dealing with foreign journalists. Perhaps I was exploiting that. But I didn't have a single great source. I had many little things from many, many people. And in some respects, in retrospect, gathered over many years. I don't think I ever sat down with anybody at the top and had a long, open conversation about the party. I just got little bits here and there.
Mm-hmm. I mean, again, you were and still are very clear-minded about what you want, what you look up, what you are after. And as you said, those sensational or pretending stories actually put people off quite quickly. And your book, focus on the structure, intricacies is actually really, really interesting. You lived and worked in China for altogether about 13 years or so, and you have met so many people, visited many places, attended a lot of talks, conferences and meetings, and obviously had many feasts, I imagine. What did you like about China, and what did you find intolerable in China?
Yeah, I don't know, the intolerable stuff. I'm pretty, we would say in English, phlegmatic person. I tend to sort of just let everything pass me by. If there's a problem, I try not to get too ruffled. And I didn't want to be one of those foreigners complaining about China, this, that, and the other. I mean, it's, that's not the point of being there. I think I think it was just the excitement of the biggest country in the world taking off. You could feel the earth moving under your feet in China, and I think people are only really waking up to that now. But I could feel it when I was there from, not so much in the 90s, but from early 2000 onwards. So that old cliche about China awakening, I really had a sense of that. The food just about everywhere was fantastic. So that's always a bonus. And the travel, the travel could be a real hassle. I think I did get worn down by, fighting my way through traffic and all that sort of thing. But, I had some fantastic trips. I would say particularly in Dongbei, Sui-Tan-He on the border of Russia. The Tuman Delta, I think one of the photos I gave you, it was great. I think I liked the rural areas best. There's very many sort of dismal small towns and dismal small cities in China. They're probably livened up these days. But, driving along the country roads when you're driving over the corn or wheat or whatever they use the wheels to crush them with and that sort of thing. And the sort of bucolic side of the countryside, I think, was the most interesting thing for me.
Mm. Since you left your post in China in 2009 and since you published your book, The Party, in 2010, have you ever been back to China?
Oh, yes, I've been back many, many times. I want to say for the record, I have never been refused a visa. I noticed this week China announced a slight easing of their COVID policy. They're now going to let people into the country with an APEC business card. I actually have an APEC card, which I fought hard to get. I don't think they're going to let me in. But no, I went back at least once, sometimes twice a year. Both my children are born in China, and my son, did his first years of school there. So every summer, because I lived in London and Washington, every northern summer, I took him back to China to study for 2 weeks language, and then I could go around and talk to people, do some study myself. So yeah, I've and also post the book on the Communist Party, I wrote the book on Sino-Japanese relations. And I've got to tell you, the Chinese Foreign Ministry cooperated with me a little bit on that. And that's, of course, because they hate the Japanese and they think they've got a good story to tell. But, you know, the party has never been a big problem for me, actually. I've never been refused a visa. I've always gone back. The last time was at the end of 2019, I guess just when things were hotting up in Wuhan. I went to a conference in Beijing. I'd love to go back now, but obviously one has to take advice on that. And, you know, we're going to see when it's going to be really open anyway.
That's great that they're asking this question, because people do make assumptions, you know, like because of the book, and then you were not allowed to be back in China.
No, I never,
contrary. So it's great to know that.
Yeah.
You are one of the very few researchers who are specialized in the trio relations, China, United States, and Japan. And in 2017, you published your second book, which we just shown, Asia's Reckoning, China, Japan, and the Fate of the US Power in the Pacific Century. Can you tell us the advantages that you have in your research and informing your views and perspectives, knowing all three countries? And
well, I hope I did have an advantage. I mean, having lived in all of them, and with Japan and China, I was always interested in that, in the bilateral relationship. I've always been interested in wartime history, wartime memory, and the politicization of it. When I was in Japan, I think it was their 50th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. So I wrote a lot about Japanese veterans, Japanese war memory, Yasukuni Shrine, and the like. And so I used to say to people, for example, if you go into any bookstore in America, there's about 77 books on America and the Middle East, America and China, you know, America and the UK, the special relationship. You go into any book in the UK, there's 50 books on the UK and France, the UK and Germany. But there's virtually nothing in the sort of popular, accessible sense on Japan and China. And that's the second and third biggest economies in the world, two Asian great powers. Fascinating story. And there's kind of nothing there. And I just thought I was really interested in it. I got great access I did get access for this book in Japan. Japan's a very open place. As I say, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spoke to me and helped me with a few things, which was very welcome. I went to China. I just got a tourist visa and went there to do research. I wouldn't do that now, by the way. And of course, was at the Wilson Center in America, which has fantastic archives as well. America is terrific like that. And so I think in the end in that book, I think it's a good book. I think I put too much detail in there because I was so excited by what I was finding out. And I should have stepped back and given a bit of a bigger picture. But nonetheless, I think it's a great topic, Japan and China. And we've got a few people in Australia who have done really great things in that area. Amy King at the ANU and Evelyn Goh at the ANU has got a new book coming out on that topic soon as well.
How delicate do you think is it for Australia to position itself in these trio relations?
Well, that's a hard question. I guess if that trio of relations now is Japan and the US and Australia, so it's delicate in a way. I think people forget about Japan. Japan is America's single biggest military ally. There are more US troops in Japan than any other country. And in some ways, the Japanese hate that. It's humiliating to have foreign troops on your soil. Nobody likes losing a war. There's a lot I can say on that. But at the same time, I think they need the Americans there because they can't manage China on their own. It's delicate for Australia to be part of that, and we can see the results all around us every day.
My last question I have to ask this, do you think not being able to manage and maintain a constructive relationship with China, meaning Australia with China, will diminish Australia's influence and impact in its relations with the US, with Asian countries and in the region?
Well, I think there's a lot of blame to go around in China and Australia. I might disagree with a lot of people on this call. I tend to think that, we had the right China policy very poorly executed, and the execution was an important part of it. But to the question itself, I think that, and the new government is trying to address this in both the Pacific, but most importantly in Southeast Asia, and improving Australia's relations there. We're not newcomers there. We have, long-standing and quite large presences in all those countries. I think our biggest embassy in the world is in Indonesia, maybe the second biggest in Papua New Guinea. But I think it's very important in Southeast Asia that we have a more independent identity. It does not do us any favors to be seen just as a cipher for the United States. That doesn't mean sort of leaning towards China in the region. It's quite the opposite, really. It's just about forging our own distinctive relations. And frankly, that should suit the United States as well, because if we're simply, the deputy sheriff, so-called, then I think that it makes us less useful partner to Southeast Asian nations. We're never going to be able to match the economic military firepower of China and the United States, but I think we can do a lot better than we have been doing, particularly in Southeast Asia.
I think I have to restrain myself and give some time to the audience to get their questions. And let's see, you touch on a few things that they asked, so we may skip those questions. This one from Peter said, your book on the party finished about 10 years ago, before Xi Jinping. If you were writing the book today, how would it change? Do you see Xi Jinping as more of an autocrat, perhaps like a Chairman Mao, like Mao in that respect?
I think that, one of the big things in the book that's obviously out of date, I talked about the collective leadership of the Communist Party. It really was, Hu Jintao was first amongst equals. Most people thought at the time that, China was too big, too complicated to go back to strongman leaderships. That's obviously wrong. Also, the book doesn't have a chapter on the United Front Department, and I started to write one, but, writing a book, I find that you basically have to finish it and get it out. I mean, in my case, I had to finish the book and get it out so I could go back to my normal job and make a living. So I think it's a pity the book doesn't have a chapter on the United Front Department either. So there's a couple of faults there. There's probably a few other little ones, but they're the ones that really I bring to mind.
And there is also a question about how can one explain the claim of China is the biggest threat to Australia, and claim made by some MPs? Right.
Well, I'd much prefer if you ask the MPs that rather than me. But it's it's not sort of like a direct threat to Australia, even though there are some people who argue that. It's that Australia is an ally of America. China is challenging America's place in the region and indeed in the world. China wants to be the most powerful country in the region and push America out. I think, there should be absolutely no surprise about that. Any big country, whether it was a communist country or a democracy in China, would do exactly the same thing. America doesn't want to retire. The strategic environment since the war, Pax Americana has been very beneficial to Australia. There's no doubt in Australia as well, there's a bit of residual anti-communism as well, however you define the Chinese government. So it's a combination of factors. So I don't really think the threat, and I know China talks about the China threat, but, China's doing lots of things. The odd thing about China is, if you think about it, it's alienated Japan, alienated Australia, alienated India. Now, why would they do that? And of course, taking on America. Many people say China is strategic and they think in 100 years, and us stupid Westerners just care about what the stock market is doing tomorrow. But if China was strategic, they would not alienate. They could if China, seduced Japan, America would be finished in Asia. So I think the behavior of the Chinese government in that respect is quite self-defeating. And instead of dividing countries, Japan, India, Australia, America, it's pushed them all together. And so I think it's not just about hysteria in Australia, and there's no doubt been some, but there's a bit of, it's an issue in China as well.
And this one is a practical question, but I'm also interested as well. Suzanne asked, Richard, did you interview directly or did you use an interpreter?
It's a bit of a mixture. I did Chinese really after Japanese properly. So, and later in life. So I, for complicated stuff, I would have somebody with me. The conversational stuff I could do myself.
Mm-hmm. And anonymous one said, a very insightful conversation. What is your prediction of Australian-China relationship in the next 3 to 5 years?
Look, it's very difficult. Everybody's on their chosen path at the moment. I think the Labor government might be able to put a floor under the relationship. Previously, every trapdoor that would open, both sides would jump into it, and it kept spiraling down. There's no reason, other countries with problems with China, like Japan and the US, they still have ministerial contacts. There's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't as well. There's lots of things we can talk about. It's an interesting question as to why China wants to patch up the relationship, a little bit, not too much. And I often wonder, in the wake of the Ukraine conflict, you look at the world with scarce commodities, scarce agricultural products and the like, China might think they, might be good to have a better relationship with Australia, which is an exporter of both those things. But I don't think anybody should expect the relationship to get much better and to return to what it was before.
I think Michael has a question, quite be interesting. I would like to know how Richard triangulates his understanding of the Chinese Communist Party, CPC. Will an understanding of communism in the USSR, Eastern Europe, valid better, would help you better understanding of China's political model?
Absolutely. I think it's really so fruitful to read about the Soviet Union. China calls itself Marxist-Leninist, but I think it's really much more Leninist than Marxist. And, the Chinese themselves studied the Soviet Union. They had a lot of obviously close ties for many years with the Soviets. So I think I think one of the textbooks I used when I was writing this book is a classic called How Russia is Ruled. It's a very thick, difficult book to read. But I think it's really, and Lenin more than Stalin, I think. So I think the Soviet Union is very valuable to study, and you get great insights into China, because the Soviets basically, set it all up for the Chinese. And I think the Chinese obviously perfected it.
Well, when I growing up in China, we read one benefit from the relationship with the USSR is the literature. We read so much Russian literature in those days. There was only, translated foreign literature were actually from great Russian writers. So there are always, upper side. One last question from audience. Given that you know so much about the Chinese government and the party structure, can you predict any positive outcomes from the upcoming 20th Party Congress?
Not sure what the question means by positive, but I think with Chinese top-level politics, you have to be very humble and careful about making predictions. I think it's pretty clear Xi will get a third term. I don't think anybody would predict against that. The big question is, the Politburo Standing Committee has 7 members. How many will retire? I predict 4, 3 on age limits, and Li Keqiang, I think he's made it clear he's going. Then you have to say who is going to take over as premier and also vice premier for the economy. And there's various names bandied around about that. And of course, will Xi Jinping nominate a successor, which some people might consider to be positive because it would, prefigure a potential peaceful transfer of power in 2027. I doubt he'll do that. As I say, I could be wrong. You've got to be careful. I doubt he'll do that. And I think for anybody named a successor to Xi Jinping could be a very dangerous position, because people can't attack Xi, but they can attack you. So I think it's a little bit early for that. Anyway, all will be unveiled when they walk out onto the stage whenever in early November.
Interesting you see that the predecessor, the successor could be more in a dangerous position, like Hua Guofeng after, Mao Zedong. Yeah, so he was obviously pulled down.
He was, and I think I saw Fred Tavis was on this call, and he's done, great work on Hua, actually, a long forgotten figure.
I have to say that's the end of our session. It's so interesting. We have so many more questions, we would love to ask you, and it's fascinating. And everyone, please thank Richard again, and also thank Jocelyn, and thank you all, audience, for your interest and attendance and very interesting questions. We look forward to having you all in our next episode of My China Story. Kevin Hopgood Brown. And everyone, good night. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you. Thank you. I appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Bye.